The following message is from GraceLife Church in Deltona, Florida. If you would like more information about GraceLife Church, or if you would like to hear more sermons from GraceLife, visit our website at www.gracelifeflorida.com.
So make your way to Romans chapter 8. We're going to read the scripture, and we're going to pray, and then we're going to worship in song a little bit more before I preach. And as you turn there, if I haven't introduced myself, I'm sorry. My name's Tommy Clayton. I'm the lead pastor here. Welcome to GraceLife. I started to say if you don't have a copy of God's Word, but the text is actually not on the back of the bulletin today. But you were given a bulletin when you walked in, and we'll refer to something in the middle of that bulletin that's called a GraceLife Connect card. We want to get feedback from you and know if you have any prayer requests, if you have any questions about anything. There's nothing off limits that you could ask us a question about. Just write it on that card, drop that into the offering plate at the end of the service, and one of our pastors will get with you in the following week. So Romans chapter 8, I just want to read the section starting in verse 18. Romans chapter 8, I'm using the English Standard Version. I want to read verses 18 through 25. Follow with me. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. Verse 20, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Verse 22, for we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pangs of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who had the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly, as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. Verse 24. For in this hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Well, you can open back up to Romans. We're not going to be there for a little while. I have a way I want to introduce this. So I was driving on Interstate 4, headed east, last Monday. Beautiful, beautiful day. Not a cloud in the sky, sunny afternoon. It was the beginning of bike week, so traffic was thick, and there were motorcycles peppered throughout the traffic. They were scattered here and there. And one rider, I saw him, he pulled his bike over to the shoulder of the highway with his girlfriend on the back, and he was riding with two other people, and one of those people had lost something off of his bike, a license plate, I think it was, fell off the back of that motorcycle, and he, being a good friend, circled back around, left his girlfriend on the bike, got off the bike, left his helmet on, and waited for just the right moment, like Frogger, and he ran out into the middle of I-4 to try and get the license plate, and he looked up, and the limited view he had with that helmet, and he was right in the line of oncoming traffic, and he panicked like we all probably would, and he darted in front of the biggest semi that I've ever seen in my life. The semi was loaded down with Mercedes-Benz cars, and this semi struck him, and it was sickening to see. I mean, the impact was devastating, and I'm not here to get really, really graphic, but just to see the impact that a 60-mile-an-hour semi loaded down with cars has on a human body. He flew through the air, and he landed in a steel heap in the middle of the highway, and he laid there. And literally, I was the first car that was able to pull off on the side of the road. There was a trucker right behind the one that hit him. The person who hit him pulled over on the side of the road, and another trucker came to a halt and slanted his rig. Pretty quick thinking action, and blocked off traffic, and we called 911. And we dashed out there, and he was initially knocked unconscious by the blow. But he woke up, and he was just howling in agony. And he was confused, and he was angry, and he was very, very frightened. And he didn't know what to do. And so we did all we could do, tried to assure him that the paramedics were on the way, and that God was going to be with him, was going to help him through that. And he was his whole body was mangled. It was mangled. There were multiple broken bones, compound fractures. I still can't get really that image quite out of my mind. and his poor girlfriend, her name was Alicia, she had to watch that entire thing unfold from the shoulder of the highway there. And she saw that semi knock him through the air. So the paramedics, I applaud our city rescue workers. They're just nothing short of astonishing. They were on the scene in minutes. They were there in their element, taking statements from people, guiding traffic, working on his mangled, broken body. And to be honest, in a situation like that, it takes me a few minutes to really resist and overcome this feeling that I'm an intrusion here. I really shouldn't be here. There's nothing really I can do. The paramedics are here, the professionals, the fire department, state troopers, sheriff, deputy, there was a helicopter. Obviously, he had to get airlifted. He was in really bad shape. And it took me a few minutes to overcome that temptation to think that I don't really need to be here. And then I remember, no, I'm a Christian and I'm a pastor. I do need to be here. I do need to be here, and God has a purpose for me being here. And then I noticed with all the work that the paramedics and the firemen were doing, his girlfriend, Alicia, over on the side of the road was just beside herself. She was just in agony. I mean, her boyfriend's in agony, getting worked on. She's in a different kind of mental anguish and agony. She's unconsolable. She feels guilty. She's afraid. She doesn't know if her boyfriend is going to even survive. She's left with all these questions, and they really can't do anything to help her. They really can't. They're not really that equipped to deal with that kind of thing. So I went over and introduced myself, and I prayed with her, and I talked to her, and come to find out that she could not get a ride to the hospital. They wouldn't let her in the chopper. It was a liability. She couldn't get a ride with the policeman, and I understand that's a liability. They're not a taxi service. So, you know, as a man without his wife, I'm thinking, should I offer to give her a ride? And I said, of course I should. Of course, if that was my daughter, I would want somebody. I'd want a pastor to give her a ride. So I offered to give her a ride if her friends would follow me on their motorcycles, and she agreed. So when the chopper lifted off, we took off. But before I did, I noticed another man pulled off on the side of the road. The person who hit, his name was Brandon, the victim. The trucker that hit him would not exit the cab. And I began to think, man, I bet that guy's in bad shape. Not because the truck got hurt. I mean, it dented the bumper, but it didn't do anything to the cab. No glass was broken or anything like that. So I walked up, and he's got his head buried in his hands, and I motioned for him to come out of the cab. And he came out, and he immediately just wept, just began to weep. And he said, I'm never going to get that image out of my mind. He said, the tape, it keeps rewinding automatically. I can't hit pause. I can't hit the erase button. He said, did you see that? Did you see what happened? He said, I couldn't help it. I couldn't swerve. And I immediately reassured him, look, his name was Todd. I said, Todd, you got eyewitnesses here. You got 2 truckers that saw it. You even got Brandon's friends that have given their statements. They've cleared you of any wrongdoing. You're not guilty. You didn't do anything wrong. Now you're thinking, why are you telling me this? You didn't study this week, did you? No, I did. I promised I studied this week. But listen, sermons, it's not just about studying the book or other books. It's about studying people. And God taught me something that day. God taught me something today. He reinforced the truth that I know, but it got really amplified and came in HD focus for me that day. Because here's what happened. When I talked to Todd, the next thing he said is he began to protest that entire accident. He said, this should not have happened. Why did this happen? He was in anguish, but he was also outraged. And he said, I've been driving for over 2 decades. I've never had an accident. I'm careful. I'm attentive. I don't do drugs like a lot of truckers do and drink on the job. And I didn't do anything wrong. And now this is I'll never be able to get this off my record or out of my mind. And it was as if he was groaning and he was protesting. He was outraged. Fast forward the tape. I got in my car. I left with Alicia. She's verbally trying to process what just happened. She's literally, she's in the passenger seat in my car with her head buried in her hands, and she's groaning, and she's sobbing. And in between sobs, she began to do the same thing. She began to protest that entire accident. Why did this have to happen? We were going to get married. We're going to have children together. Now he's probably not even going to make it. He's going to die. He's a kind person. He's so compassionate. He was going back to retrieve one of his friend's license plate. He did the same thing last week with his buddy's iPhone that fell in the middle of the pavement. He went back and got it. Why did this have to happen to us? Why? She was outraged. She was protesting. Listen, they were protesting the wrongness of that accident, saying this kind of thing shouldn't happen in the world. It's wrong. It's not right. And listen, here's what God taught me. When tragedy happens, if you listen carefully, people's worldviews began to leak out. They ooze out of them. They can't help it. You say, that's a fancy word. I've never heard that before. What's a worldview? Here's what a worldview is. It is a deeply held belief, okay? It's a deeply held belief by every single person in the world that shapes the way you think about the world you live in, okay? Let me say that again. A worldview is a deeply held belief that shapes the way you think about the world. You could think of it like a lens. It's the lens through which you view this world. And there's three questions involved in a worldview. What's the world supposed to be like? What happened? Because it's not like that, obviously. And how can it be fixed? Okay? Their worldviews were leaking out. Something very profound and theological was happening with Alicia protesting and being outraged at that accident, rightly so, and Todd being outraged and protesting in that accident, and both of them were groaning. And listen, it doesn't even really require a tragedy for somebody's worldview to leak out. That happened on Monday afternoon. Tuesday afternoon, my wife is coming back from Orlando from an ultrasound. She's about 18 weeks pregnant now, and she had her ultrasound there, and she's coming back, and her friend Melissa is with her, and out of nowhere, there's this big piece of iron, a piece of metal, and it comes careening down the interstate toward their minivan. And it goes under the minivan, thank God. It went under the minivan and made a lot of loud, angry, bad noises. Sounded like a pinball going in and out. And the noises were so angry but that both of them grew concerned. That did some damage down there. And so my wife took it to the Nissan dealership, and indeed it did. It did $500 worth of damage and gutted the underside of our minivan. And so my wife calls me, and what do you think we did? We protested that. We were not, I use this term loosely, we were outraged, okay? Who's going to pay for this? I mean, what kind of world do we live in? You're going down the interstate, minding your own business, and a piece of iron comes careening out and guts the underside of your minivan. Our worldview was leaking out, wasn't it? The deeply held belief that shapes the way we see the world. That's not supposed to happen. We were groaning. When we got the bill, especially, we were groaning. Now, that was Tuesday afternoon. Tuesday evening, when I got home from work, my wife told me that the kid next door that borrowed our son's fishing rod, she said, something's fishy going on there. And she said, he came over here, and he was bone dry, and he said, Mrs. Clayton, yeah, so when a kid says that, get ready. He said, so a big fish, took the bait and, ripped the fishing rod out of my hand, and it went under the water, and I did my best to rescue it, but it's gone. I'm sorry. 10-year-old kid, and my wife, Lieutenant Colombo, looks at the kid. He's bone dry. His shoes are tied. She says, okay, well, thank you for telling me. Maybe my husband can come and help you look for it a little bit later. And he says, okay. And he went back. So I got home, and I went over across the street down by the pond, and lo and behold, I saw the 10-year-old kid and his friend fishing with my son's fishing rod. I mean, pretty much caught him red-handed, and I tried to be as gracious as I could and use it as a kind of teaching moment. But you know what? Mentally, I protested that. That outraged me because that shouldn't happen. Listen, doesn't take a tragedy. It just takes you being personally wronged, right? Something that doesn't comport with your worldview. Because what kind of world is it? 20-year-old kids shouldn't get hit by semis. And pieces of metal shouldn't come careening down the interstate. And your neighbor's kids whom you loan your son's fishing rod shouldn't try to steal it from you. And truckers driving for over 2 decades without an accident shouldn't have that on their conscience the rest of their life. What in the world is wrong? What in the world is going on here? But let's go further than that. What about this? How about children born with birth defects? Do you protest that mentally when that happens? Why? Why does stuff like this have to happen? Or what about this? What about children that are born without birth defects but are molested? Or who eventually enter into the sex trafficking trade? Somebody does that on their behalf, rather. What about that? Now listen carefully. There is something wrong around us, isn't there? There's war, there's poverty, there's corrupt governments, There's racism, there's inequality, there's school shootings, there's terrorist attacks. Hey, there's AIDS, there's cancer, there's diabetes, there's natural disasters like tsunamis and earthquakes and fire and tornadoes. There's something wrong with this world. We see it in people, we see it in nature. There's something wrong among us, okay? There's something wrong among us. This hatred and injustice, inequality, division. You know, tomorrow we have a GOP primary in the state of Florida. And I've watched some of the debates, not all of them. You can only stomach so much. But we have a primary here in our state in Florida, and I hope that you pray about who God would have you vote for. And we have some voter guides out here to help inform you. We're not going to tell you who to vote for. That's your decision. But listen, have you ever seen the United States more divided than it is? You know, people say we should take, in God we trust, off the money. You should take United off states on the money, because we've never been more divided in the history of our nation. Listen, even people that are in the same, they're on the same ticket for Republicans. It's like they're at each other's throats. We see something's wrong among us. Listen, something's wrong within us, if we're honest. This is where it really gets home. This is where I start to meddle. Hey, we're unhappy. We're radically insecure. We're jealous and we're angry. And the little trite, trivial things that seem to promise happiness, they're so fleeting in their nature, aren't they? There's something wrong around us. There's something wrong among us. There's something wrong within us. There's no peace. There's no joy. We have guilt. We're anxious. We're fearful. And it's precisely, listen to this, it's precisely at this point that both believers and unbelievers agree with one another. That's better than coffee to wake you up, isn't it? Did you hear me? Let me say that again. It's precisely at this point that both believers in Christ and unbelievers who don't believe in Christ and maybe reject the Bible, they're both in agreement. Something is dreadfully wrong with the world we live in. And something is wrong inside of us too. I mean, nobody here, believer or unbeliever, you wouldn't want your thoughts projected up there over the last 24 hours, say, would you? Everything for all of us to read? No, you wouldn't. Why? Because there's something wrong inside of us. We all know it. Maybe we don't talk about it. There's something wrong, and we would agree. In fact, I'm going to give the outline for this sermon here, and I want you to hear this as somebody. I'm going to have a... Man, I used to not like it when somebody would say this. I'm going to have kind of a conversation, and I want you to listen in, and it's going to be between me and an unbeliever, okay? Not somebody angry or hostile, just somebody that has a really friendly objection and a genuine question about, in their mind, the irreconcilable... Here, let me say that. I'm a redneck. I can't even get that word out. They see a contradiction, okay, but between Christianity and the suffering and the evil they take note of in the world, okay? So 4 points. My 4 points to the unbeliever, and I want you to hear this, okay? Number 1, you are right to be outraged at evil and suffering. I would say that to the unbeliever. You are absolutely right to be outraged. In fact, to be outraged is a good thing. It's a good thing. You know, Jeff has been talking for the last several weeks about gospel judo. When you hear an unbeliever share things, when you're talking with them about the gospel, sometimes you can use their momentum. Listen, this is the ultimate gospel judo on steroids, okay? Because everybody does this. You don't have to listen very long before somebody protests something wrong in the world. Politics, homelessness, sickness, processed foods, okay? Everybody has their thing that knocks the world off balance for them. And when you hear that, it's okay to agree and say, I agree with you. That is dreadfully wrong. Such things shouldn't happen in the kind of world we live in. You hear them protest crimes like identity theft, somebody getting bullied at school, or when you hear someone protest suffering like the death of a family pet, or somebody going through a bitter divorce, or somebody gets the cancer diagnosis and they protest that. They groan. They're outraged at it. That's a good thing. They're right to be outraged. Listen, the world is broken. Our bodies are broken. Everybody knows that things are seriously out of whack. I've been a pastor long enough to see how this works. And listen, I want to be honest with you now. Most of you have been in some type of classroom, either in high school or college, and you've had philosophy, and you've encountered this problem. It's called the problem of evil and suffering, and it's in textbooks and maybe a debate hall. Somebody behind a desk was writing. But listen, when this comes home, it's when it's personal. So the question is not really if God is all good and God is all powerful, why do evil and suffering exist in the world? That's not really the question we have if we're honest. Here's the real question. If God exists and He's real and He's all powerful and He's all benevolent, why do bad things happen to me? Right? That's the real question. You're thinking it. I just want to say it for you because I asked the same thing. And you're right to be outraged. Why do such things happen to me? That's the real question. And it's not for scholars to duke out. It's for us. It's for the here and now. Because listen, you don't have to be a theologian or a philosopher. You can be a teenager or a mom and protest those things too, right? Or a dad. That outrage and that grief you feel, even though it's misdirected, talking to unbelievers, it's a misdirected outrage. I'll share more about that in a minute. It's right to feel that. It's right to feel that. This is not the way the world is supposed to be. Here's the point number 2, okay? First point was, as an unbeliever, you're right to protest that and to be outraged to that. Number 2, talking to an unbeliever, your worldview cannot account for your outrage. Now listen really carefully. Put your thinking hat on for a minute here, okay? Your worldview, the deeply held set of beliefs you have that shape the way you think about the world, with the worldview you have as an unbeliever, you really can't rationally, logically, or reasonably explain why you're outraged. You can't. You really don't have any explanation for it with the beliefs that you hold, okay? And I'll explain why. Your worldview is supposed to explain how things are supposed to work in the world. But the unbeliever's worldview is broken. It's just as broken as the world they live in. It's just as broken as our fallen bodies. It's a cracked lens. This lens through which they view this world, it's cracked. It's broken and it's inconsistent. In fact, theologians would say it this way. They would say that an unbeliever, even to function in this world, has to borrow from the Christian worldview. Now, I'm not trying to make smoke go out of your ears, okay? Let me illustrate this. How many of you were in high school and you couldn't quite drive yet? Or maybe you could, but you couldn't afford a car. Your parents couldn't afford a car. But there was somebody in the school that had wheels, right? They had wheels. You didn't care much for them, okay? But they had wheels. And you were happy for them to take you everywhere you needed to go. Even though the car was dirty and you didn't really like it and you didn't like hanging out with that person, you would use them to get you everywhere you needed to go in this world. That's exactly what an unbeliever does with the Christian worldview. Their worldview can't explain this outrage. So they'll borrow the Christian worldview. They'll get in that car to go where they need to go. Does that make sense? Well, it will in a minute. I'll explain it as we go, okay? In Christianity, being outraged makes sense. You should be outraged. You should protest. You should groan. Because listen, this world is supposed to be a world of peace and of order, not chaos, not crime. It's supposed to be a world where righteousness reigns, where there's harmony, where there's no conflict between people. There's no conflict between animals. There's no conflict between people and animals, okay? There's supposed to be no pain, no suffering, no corruption, no violence, no tsunamis, no death, no volcanic eruptions, no mudslides, no cancer, no diabetes, none of those things. In the Christian worldview, those things are intrusions. They're invasions. They're unwelcome. They don't belong here. And let me explain why. Because the Bible says, this is where the Bible comes into play. Yes, it does. Because listen, the Christian worldview has a source, and that source is the Bible. And the Bible adequately and reasonably and rationally explains how the world should be, what happened to the world, and the only way to fix this world and the people in it. And the Bible says in Genesis 3 that God created the earth, the heavens and the earth. And He created animals. He created nouns, people, places, and things, right? And He made them perfectly. And He made a declaration over them. It is what? Good. That's the refrain over and over in Genesis. And on the first day, the second day, third day, it is good. It is good. It is good. And then He made the pinnacle, the crown of His creation, man and woman, and He looked at them, and He made this declaration. He said, it is very good. And there was no disorder. There was no disruption. Adam and Eve, imagine this. A husband and a wife never argued. We don't know how long it was until sin came, but it wasn't long. They never argued. Listen, there was harmony between man and woman. Hard to imagine that. There was actually understanding between man and woman, okay? There was harmony, there was love, there was peace, there was acceptance. There was harmony between people and animals, okay? When you saw a lion, you didn't have to run the other way. And when a lion saw a lamb, the lamb didn't have to run the other way. And here's the most important distinction to make. There was peace between God and His creation, okay? And the Bible says something dreadful happened. Something awful happened. Sin entered. There was rebellion. There was cosmic treason. Adam and Eve rebelled against God's good word, and a curse came upon the world because of sin. The Bible says because of sin, a curse came. And there was no longer peace, there was no longer joy, there was no longer order. There was chaos, and there was conflict, and there was enmity and hostility between man and woman, between man and animals. And listen, most importantly, and this is what caused all of that, there was relational disharmony between God, the Creator, and His creation, people. In fact, I had a seminary professor, and his name was Dr. Cragen. You remember him, Jeff? And he had a terrible illness, and it caused him to have to retire early. And Dr. Cragen, he was one of the best teachers I've ever sat under. But this illness caused him, he could only whisper. But it also added drama to all of his lectures because he sounded like Richard Harris. You guys know who that is? He was Caesar in the movie Gladiator. And he played the cellmate of Jim Caviezel in the movie Count of Monte Cristo. And he had this voice like Caesar. And he would talk, and it was so profound. And he would say, "Men, you must remember that sin was not welcome. It was an enemy. It intruded, and we should hate it." I don't know why he wasn't British. He said we should hate sin. We should protest sin. It's not welcome. It's not our friend. What it did, what it's doing, what it will continue to do, it's an outrage. And he explained that for us, and that's the right way to view the world. And listen, so this protest, this outrage, for a Christian to have that protest and outrage, it makes sense. For an unbeliever, they can't explain that outrage they have. But we should talk to them about it. That's an entry point to talk about the gospel and to talk about the way the world used to be and the way it should be. Do you know who C.S. Lewis is? He's a famous Christian author and apologist, and he was a famous atheist at one time. And he wrote about how he came to be converted. And this is what he said. He came to realize that suffering and evil presented an even bigger problem for his atheism than it did for Christianity. This is what he said. He said, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust." Now listen to this. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own, but if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Consequently, atheism turned out to be too simple. Do you hear what Lewis is saying? He's saying, if you say that the world is filled with injustice, then you're saying, okay, so there's a standard for being just. If you say the world is filled with unrighteousness, then you're saying there's a standard of righteousness. If you're saying that the world is cruel and inhumane, then you're saying there's a certain code of conduct that's human. You understand what Lewis was saying? And when an unbeliever protests those things, he rightly should, but in his worldview, he cannot make sense of them. I'll tell you this. I'm going to get really honest with you, okay? And let's get in the unbeliever's car that didn't have one earlier, and let's drive it, and let's see where it goes. If we're just the latest pond scum to float up on the beach, okay, why not injustice? Why not live like a pirate and a Viking and winner takes all? Why not? Why not genetic cleansing? Why not? Why not a Holocaust? Why are any of those things considered wrong with an unbelieving worldview? Why? In fact, I will say this. Atheism and its companion, evolutionism, they depend on death. They actually depend on death and survival of the fittest to make sense. So do you see, Lewis was saying how he was being totally honest as an atheist and saying, I see that my worldview is inconsistent with my protesting God's reality by saying there's evil and injustice in the world. Do you see that? That's really interesting to me. I know there's a lot of different angles we could look at evil and suffering. I just want to give the rifle approach. And I'm saying you're right to protest that, unbeliever, but you don't have any explanation. You don't have any explanation in your worldview for why you should protest it. None. And I would say this, if human beings, one of the reasons that Christians can explain why we should treat one another with compassion and with love and with tenderness is because we have dignity. We're not animals. We are made in the image of God. We're made in His likeness. We have His characteristics, which includes ethics and morality and love and grief when we see somebody wronged and a desire to help people when they're hurting. Atheism can't explain that. It's inadequate. Evolution can't explain it. It's inadequate. So you can't say as an unbeliever, that's messed up. That's not right. That's wrong, because you're implying there's a rightness, there's a wholeness, there's a righteousness, there's a justice. My son Marshall loves putting together puzzles. He's 4 years old, and he does not want to look at the picture on the box when he does it. I have to look at that picture. But listen, if you don't look at the picture on the box, you can just put that puzzle together any old way you want. But if you don't look at the picture, you have no reason to protest and say, well, that's dumb. That doesn't look like anything. It looks like just a heap of cardboard cutouts. And that's exactly what the unbeliever does, is he puts this puzzle of life together, and he protests it, but he threw away the cover on the box. So he has no reason to protest. As a matter of fact, to show you one more thing in this point, the reason unbelievers are so inconsistent when they get especially outraged at other people wronging them, like my neighbor trying to steal my fishing rod. Francis Schaeffer said this. Well, listen to this. This is so helpful to me. I hope it helps you. Francis Schaeffer said this. He said, let's do something dangerous. Let's put the Bible aside for a minute, and let's tell the unbeliever, listen, you know, God is going to hold you accountable for your life, for every deed, every thought, every word, every action. And on the final day, when you stand before Him in judgment, He's going to judge you based on your own code of conduct. And you say, well, that's strange. Yeah, Francis Schaeffer said this. He said, imagine if God, when you stand before Him in judgment, He says, I'll take that invisible recorder hanging around your neck now. And you say, huh, what? He says, yeah, you didn't know this. You had an invisible tape recorder hanging around your neck. And every time you said the words ought or should, it automatically activated that recorder. And it recorded when you said, he shouldn't have cut me off like that in traffic. She shouldn't gossip about me like that. He shouldn't steal my fishing rod. He shouldn't be speeding. He shouldn't have ran that stop sign. They shouldn't let their front yard get so ugly and make our neighborhood look unvaluable. I mean, fill in the blank. Every time you judge somebody based on he should, she should, or they ought to, or they ought not to, Francis Schaeffer said, beloved, he said, that tape recorder on the final day of judgment would be sufficient without any other source of authority to condemn every single person who's ever been born. Because nobody can even live up to their own standard for living. And it's the truth, and you know it is. And an unbeliever, if they're honest, they would confess that's exactly right. Because Romans 2 says, listen, Romans chapter 2 says, it's an accusation by the Apostle Paul, and he says, why do you protest those who don't keep the law, but you, being hypocritical, you violate the same law that you're protesting. And unbelievers do that too. So they have no grounds for protesting. Here's the third point. I'm talking to the unbeliever, okay? You are not alone in your groaning and outrage. Well, this is so helpful. You are not alone in your groaning. Alicia and Todd and my wife and I and you, when you groan and you protest and you're outraged, did you know that you're not alone? You know that passage I read at the beginning of our service, Romans chapter 8? How did I get in Jeremiah? Go back to Romans. Here we go. Listen to this. It's a really significant passage. And Paul is talking about suffering and evil and hardship and affliction. And he is encouraging the Roman Christians and saying, look, the sufferings of this present world, they're not even worthy to be compared to the glory we're going to share one day in heaven with Christ for all eternity, when He'll wipe away every tear and there will be no more death or sickness. But he says this. Look at verse 22. Verse 22. He says, "For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now." You say, what in the world is that talking about? It's talking about this. Even creation itself manifests. Now, this is kind of strange, okay? I would say things like volcanoes and earthquakes and mudslides and tornadoes, those are supposed to be irregular and abnormal. It's not the way God created the world at all. When you see those things happening, it's almost as if Paul is he's personifying creation and saying, the whole creation groans. You watch the African Serengeti on a documentary and you see these lions tearing these zebras to pieces. You see the hyenas fighting the lions. It's the whole creation. There's something about that. When you see an alligator snap down on an antelope's muzzle when they're trying to cross the Nile River, there's something inside of you that says, this is not the way it's supposed to. This is not right. And all of creation agrees with you. And I'm not saying that animals are made in God's image. They're not. But I'm just simply saying what the Apostle Paul is saying here. He says a little bit earlier, we groan, we protest, and even creation groans and knows this is not the way it's supposed to be. But I want to tell you something that's even more encouraging to you, is that Jesus Christ groans, and he protests the way this world is, and he's outraged by it. You say, that sounds kind of, yeah, I know it does. Turn to John chapter 11 real quick. I preached a long sermon last week, and I don't want to preach a long sermon today, so turn there quick. John chapter 11. If you've been around a Bible or a church for very long, you've heard this. If you've been to a funeral, you've probably heard this passage. You know, Jesus Christ had friends when he was on the earth, and the Bible says that he loved Lazarus and Lazarus' whole family. He had two sisters, Martha and Mary. And Lazarus grew very sick, and he died. And Jesus, the Bible says, deliberately waited for 3 days for Lazarus to die and then to get good and dead, okay? Like, no trickery here. His heart stopped. His breath stopped. He was beginning to stink, actually, it says here. And Jesus Christ went to his hometown of Bethany, and it's really interesting the scene that unfolds there. And I want to read this to you. Verse 32, this is when Mary came out to Jesus and invited him into the house where all the mourners and people that were weeping were. Listen to this. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." She's protesting her brother's death, and rightly so. If you were good friends with the Son of God and he let your brother die, you'd probably say the same thing, right? And look at verse 33 here. Oh man, you should underline this. If you're the kind of person that writes in their Bible, you should underline this. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. Now, there's probably a little numeric footnote there, right? And some translations rightly use that word, he was deeply moved. He was indignant. You know what that word always means? Anger. Even in the original root, you know what it means? I'm not going to do it because something bad will happen. It's somebody snorting air through their nose really hard. An animal, actually. It's a horse going angry, kicking at the ground. That's the root for that word. Jesus was indignant. You're thinking, what in the world? Why? Why was Jesus angry there? It seems like a really inappropriate time for somebody to be angry when there's a dead body laying in front of you. And I want to tell you why. Because Jesus was outraged at what sin had done to his perfect world. He was outraged at it. He knew, I did not create this world to experience pain and suffering and grief on this level. I didn't. And even though he had knowledge and he had power and he knew he was about to overturn that suffering and going to the cross, he was going to overturn all suffering. Jesus Christ, the old King James Version I like, it says he groaned in his spirit. Does that encourage you to know you're not alone when you're groaning at evil and suffering and pain and unrighteousness and immorality and divorce and child molestation and domestic abuse and hurricanes and cancer? You're not alone, friend. Don't think that God mocks at our pain. He doesn't. He enters into our pain. He entered in the incarnation. God crawled into a human body and walked amongst us. And Jesus was outraged at this evil that he saw, and death and suffering. And here's what's really interesting. The very next verse, well, a few verses down, it's the shortest verse in the Bible, and what is it? Jesus wept. How can both of those things converge into the same human mind and body? Because he's 100% God and he's 100% man. He was outraged at the evil and the fallenness and the sin and the pain and the suffering he saw, and he also wept and was compassionate over it. So you show me any other worldview, any other religion, any other philosophy, whom the person who has the solution isn't mocking the creatures. He's with them, crying, weeping, having compassion. You know, Jesus touched lepers. They were considered unclean. He was the friend of sinners. He wept over their hardship. He endured with them. He cried with them. You're not alone in your groaning and outrage. Jesus was outraged. He hated death. He detested sin. Listen, we can mitigate suffering, okay? This is the last point. There's nothing. We can protest suffering and evil. We're not alone in our protesting. But listen, there's nothing we can do about it. Does that encourage you this morning? There's absolutely nothing that you can do ultimately about pain and suffering and evil and sin in the world. There's nothing you can do. You can protest it. You can be outraged at it. Thank God we have common grace. We have doctors. We have some in our congregation. We have some dentists in our congregation. We have like the rescue workers that came that day that I saw the wreck, and we can mitigate suffering. We can medicate people. We can help people. We can put people back together the best we can. Modern medicine and technology, we have antidepressants. God has been so gracious. But listen, ultimately we're all going to die. I mean, that's the ultimate form of suffering. You know that, right? Death and then condemnation that follows if you're unrighteous. And we all are. The Bible says there are none righteous, no, not one. And listen, even the apprehension and the anxiety that accompanies knowing you're a creature, you're made of the dust, and one day your life is going to end. Even that anguish, that guilt. It's not just what you see. There's internal suffering. We have guilt and anguish in our minds, and there's nothing that we can do about it. None of us have any solution. All we have are protest and tears. All we can do is be outraged. But listen, Jesus was not only outraged, Jesus not only wept, Jesus came to end this without ending us. That's really the gospel. How can God come and end sin without ending sinners? How can he be just and also justify ungodly people? Here's what some unbelievers would say. They would say, you know what? I see a lot of evil, and it seems to me to be pointless. There's no point or purpose in any of it, and that just makes me even more angry and disbelieving in the Bible. But listen, I want to tell you the greatest suffering, the greatest evil that was ever committed did the greatest good. Did you know that? What's the greatest act of evil that was ever committed in the history of the world? A little quick history lesson. You know what it was? It was the cross. It was Jesus Christ, a righteous, perfect, innocent man who was condemned to die, and he was judged, and he was crucified, which is the greatest, most horrific form of torture known to humanity. So great, in fact, it was outlawed by Constantine when he became the emperor. And more than that, Jesus Christ was abandoned by his Father. He was forsaken. He walked into a sin-cursed world, and the Bible says that Jesus became a curse for us. What did Jesus do about evil and suffering? Jesus said, how about this? How about I come and I live a perfect, righteous life? The kind of life that I create of all of you to have, but you rejected that. I'll come and I'll live that perfect life that you could never live, and I'll give you my life and trade for yours. I'll trade places with you, and I'll go to the cross, and I'll suffer abandonment by my Father. I'll suffer rejection and treachery by my friends. I'll be betrayed. I'll be lied about, spit on, cursed, mocked, what we all deserve, and I'll trade places with you. That's what Jesus Christ did. Listen to what 1 Peter 3:18 says. Because, let me preface it this way. The problem with the world is a relational problem, okay? It's a relational problem. We rebelled against our Maker, and the Bible says our sins have separated us from God. It's a relational problem. And the only way that this sin is going to be fixed is for that relationship to be repaired and restored, and for us to be reconciled to our Maker. And listen to this, because this all comes together right here in this verse. 1 Peter 3:18 says this, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God." Oh, did you hear that? Jesus Christ suffered the greatest act of suffering. Was it pointless? No, 1,000 no's. It had the greatest purpose and object in the history of the world, to bring us, unrighteous people, back to God. That's what the suffering of Christ accomplished, beloved. And it did. He did accomplish that. That's good news, isn't it? And it's good news that Jesus Christ is not repulsed by suffering and evil. You know what? He is attracted to need. Ray Ortlund said that. Jesus Christ is wonderfully attracted to need. He is not a distant landlord. He's not disinterested. The Bible says he is near the brokenhearted, and he desires to save the crushed in spirit. And Isaiah 66 says, "Upon this person will I look, him who is contrite and convicted and humble in heart." And Jesus Christ said this. Listen to this amazing invitation he extended to unbelievers. He said, "All you who are broken and bruised," I'm paraphrasing, "and heavy laden and tired and restless and guilty and condemned and hopeless, you come to me. Come unto me, and I will give you rest for your souls. For I am lowly, and my burden is so light, and my yoke is easy, and I'll give you rest for your souls." That's the invitation that your Creator extends to you through His Son, Jesus Christ. So what did Jesus do? Listen, He conquered death. All we can do is protest it and get outraged. And Jesus did those things too, and He groaned. But Jesus conquered death. And now we can say with the Apostle Paul, "Oh, death, where's your victory? Grave, where's your sting?" Hey, death is not an enemy to us anymore. It's just the threshold over which we step into eternity. So we say to death, "Hey, do your worst. The lower in the grave you put me, the higher Jesus Christ is going to raise me." That's the good news of the gospel. Is that good news to you this morning? Yes, there's evil and suffering in the world. Yes, we should protest it. No, unbelievers have no cause to protest it. But we do. And listen, we're not alone. Jesus protested. Jesus was outraged. Jesus groaned. But Jesus did something about it. He entered into our sufferings. He entered into our pain. He died, the Bible says, to bring us to God. And so we have an empty cross and we have an empty grave. We have an empty cross and we have an empty grave. And listen, don't we all long for the kind of place where there's no more tears, there's no more suffering, there's no more cancer, there's no more crime? Listen, if you belong to Jesus Christ, you repent of your sins, and you believe upon Christ, the Bible says He is preparing a place for you where this world will be restored. That's the linear history we read in the Bible. Creation, fall, redemption, and then we forget this one over here, restoration. A place where every tear will be wiped away, every disease will be healed. Theologians, they speculate. We'll be able to fly, maybe at the speed of thought, go from one place to the other. It's going to be something to behold, heaven is. And Jesus is there preparing a place for us even now. Do you know Christ? Do you know Him this morning? Have you placed your trust in Jesus Christ? Have you said, "I'm wearied, I'm tired, I'm tired of living in this world with no hope. I'm tired of the guilt. I'm tired of not having peace in my heart and in my mind. I'm ready. I'm ready for Christ to come and make all things new." That's the promise He makes. "I come, and behold, I make all things new." Will you give your heart to the Lord Jesus Christ? He says, "Come unto me, all you who labor